on Fridays, you know, because we can't get people to come, but here we've got a very nice audience in the room. I called you guys the physicals, and we got the virtuals who are dialing in right now at the same time, and we've got a very nice group that are with us today, and I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us, both the physicals and the virtuals. You know, my name is John Hamre. I'm the president at CSIS, and my role here is strictly ornamental because the substance is coming in just a minute. But I can't help but take just a little bit of time here with everybody here. This is a joint effort that we're doing today, and we're partnering with, CSIS is partnering with Yonsei Institute for Sinology and with the Institute of National Policy Research in Taiwan. And it's a first for us to do this kind of a trilateral. Actually, it has for me, it's a very interesting kind of punctuation point, if it will, in my own personal life. I remember when I first went to Beijing when I was here at CSIS, and remember getting a lecture from quite a senior person in the foreign ministry about, well, you guys, you know, if you take care of Taiwan, we'll take care of North Korea. And I said, well, wait a minute, it doesn't work like that. You know, I mean, you want to take care of North Korea because it's in your interest to do that. I'm not going to trade you anything for that. You know, that doesn't make any sense. And we intentionally tried to keep these separate. We tried to keep Korea and Taiwan separate, you know, for so many years because of that kind of. We didn't want to create the kind of the parallelism of the problem. Unfortunately, actions really by China over the last 5 to 10 years have really made them put them on top of each other. And we now have to do this. This is the first time we've done a trilateral like this. And I think it's very important. Unfortunately, we're going to have to do more of it, you know, going forward, because we have a common destiny here to try to figure out how are we going to ensure peace and stability in Asia, and we're all together in this now. Last year we did a series of war games on what would a war with China over Taiwan look like. You know, we did 24 different war games, different renditions of how it would unfold, et cetera, and it would be a catastrophe. Yes, we could prevent the collapse of the government in Taipei, but the price that everyone would pay would be astounding, absolutely astounding. And what I drew from this was we have to try to find ways where we are working together more effectively so that we don't have a war, so that we can deter, and then we can find pathways where we can knit ourselves together in a constructive way, you know, so that the dominant dynamic is peaceful resolution of tensions in the region, not war. And sadly, this is going to be something we're going to have to put more attention to, I think, in coming years. I don't think we have collectively, President Yoon was here about 2 weeks ago, as I recall, and Dr. Cha organized a small roundtable with President Yoon over at Blair House. And I was really enormously impressed with his vision, his conviction that we're in a time when democracies do have to find their capacity to both defend themselves and to collaborate with others in a defense. I was very impressed by his vision. And this is something we're going to have to do more of, that we do not have among us, Taiwan, U.S., Korea, other countries, we don't have among us the infrastructure of coordination. We're going to need to build that, because that becomes a key element to our future of peace through deterrence and strength and cooperation. So I think we're going to explore all of those things today. My role now is over, except I do want to say thank you to Dr. Cha, to Dr. Kim, and to Dr. Kuo for their sponsorship for their respective organizations. Victor is going to introduce each of you, and so let me first turn to you, Victor, and thank you. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Hamre, for those opening remarks and helping us to start off this morning's session. My name is Victor Cha. I'm Senior Vice President for Asia and Korea Chair at CSIS, and we do a annual bilateral consultation with our Korean friends and colleagues. But this year we decided to try something different, which was to do this as a trilateral, but not the trilateral you would normally expect, which is the U.S., South Korea, and Japan, but instead to do it with the U.S., South Korea, and Taiwan. What's the reason for that? Well, part of it is that, which should not be surprising to any of you, is that the international system right now is one in which everybody is experiencing security deficits. All countries are feeling as though their security is under duress. And this certainly does have to do with U.S. China competition, the new template for U.S. China relations, but it also has to do with the war in Europe. It has to do with North Korea's activities. It has to do with domestic politics in countries. We have an election in Taiwan soon. We have an election here in the United States. And then as well as in Korea, we have legislative elections. So the combination of these domestic and external factors, I think, has created a great deal of uncertainty. And it has really collapsed the theater, the security theaters that we normally study. We normally think of these theaters as separate. The Taiwan theater, the Korean Peninsula theater, even the Europe theater, South China Sea. We used to see these as very discrete and separate security issues. But I think this combination of external, internal factors has really sort of pushed them all together such that we can't really distinguish how something that happens in one theater does not also impact something happening in another theater. So I think that is part of what brought us together as a group for the first of, I hope, continuous interaction among the three organizations, us, CSIS, the Yonsei Institute for Sinology, and INPR. So I look forward to a very good and interesting discussion today. So I've asked both our leaders from the other two institutes if they would say a few words. Dongchan Kim is the currently assistant professor at the Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei University and is an executive committee member of the Yonsei Institute for Sinology. We'll ask him to offer some opening remarks first, and then after him we'll ask Director Eugene Kuo, who is professor at the Institute of China and Asia-Pacific Studies at National Sun Yat-sen University, and he's also director of the master's program, and as well as director of INPR. We'll ask him to speak next. So, Dr. Kim.
Thank you, Victor Cha. Good morning, everyone. It's a wonderful Friday morning. I'm Dongchan Kim from Yonsei Institute for Sinology. It's an honor to have this chance to make opening remarks in front of such distinguished scholars and prominent colleagues and audience. At first, I'd like to thank Victor Cha and all CSIS members for hosting and inviting me to this seminar. And the Yonsei Institute for Sinology was established in 2015 with the generous financial support of Mr. Yu Kyung-sun, who is founder of Korea company called Haimat, and she is also alumnus of Yonsei University. Thanks to his generous research funding, YIS has been actively conducting researches on China, comprehensive researches on China for last 8 years. So I'd like to take this opportunity to express my special gratitude for his generous financial support to U.S. YIS. Also, I'd like to thank the Uni Korea Foundation for providing research funding to YIS every year since 2018. With the financial support of the Uni Korea Foundation, we could expand exchanges with Chinese scholars and build a foundation and networks for research on China. In 2015, Director Hyun-Chul Kim established YIS. He is a distinguished scholar in Korean academia and also served the Dean of Liberal Arts College at Yonsei University. Under his leadership, YIS aims to provide for many young scholars to conduct research on China. As a result, we have successfully found like-minded scholars who agree with our visions. Throughout our effort over the last 8 years, YIS already built stable networks for exchanges and research between Korea and China. So our next goal is to extend our research network to the United States and establish various trilateral consultative bodies to conduct cooperative research on China and gather some ideas and wisdom of each country. So I think today's seminar is the first step toward realizing our new vision. And we are very pleased to be a partner of CSIS and INPR. I hope today's seminar will be the beginning of multilateral exchange platform for China study and research. Lastly, I am really looking forward to discussing important security issues on the Korean Peninsula and Indo-Pacific region with distinguished scholars. Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to invite Director Kuo to the podium. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Eugene, currently Director of INPR, Institute for National Policy Research at Taiwan. INPR is the only nonpartisan, non-governmental think tank at Taiwan, and it was established in 1989. INPR so far has produced numerous ministerial-level government officials for Taiwan, and is one of very important voicing mechanism for Taiwan as well. And it is a great pleasure to co-host this event along with CSIS and Yonsei University from Korea. As Dr. Chow just mentioned, after the outbreak of Korean War last year, the entire security attention internationally has been paid to the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan Strait. With China's assertive action against Taiwan, and also Chinese and Russian strategic manipulation over Korean Peninsula. Those two countries, Taiwan and Korea, we actually share a lot in common. Both countries are mature democracies, robust economies, and also possessing cutting-edge technologies, including semiconductor. And not to mention, those two countries have been facing imminent security threats from autocracies. And also, those two countries have very strong military and diplomatic ties with the United States. Having said that, this event, as Dr. Chow and Dr. Kim just mentioned, it is very creative and very timely manner to have this event, having all these experts from 3 countries to discuss together. And my last point is hoping that this creative style of seminar could produce more profound implications to all 3 countries together. Thank you.
So thank you both, Dr. Kim, Dr. Kuo, for your opening remarks. My understanding now is we're going to take a quick break so we can just switch the stage up for the first panel. Is that right? Okay. All right. So for those of you online, if you could just hold on for 1 second. Same with folks in the room. Thank you very much.
Is that, are the slides not going to be on that screen?
I think it's okay. Yeah.
Oh, it's okay.
Briefly summarize.
Sure, yeah, I'll make it very crisp. Sure. All right, well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate your patience, and thanks again to those of you joining us here physically at CSIS and those of you watching online. My name is Yonsei Cheney. I'm the Deputy Director for Asia here at CSIS and also a Senior Fellow at the Japan Chair. And it's really my pleasure to join this distinguished panel of colleagues to talk about how we can build that infrastructure for coordination in the Indo-Pacific, as Dr. Hamre mentioned earlier. Let me briefly introduce you to the panel, and then we'll get started. To my immediate, excuse me, to my immediate left is Dr. Dongchang Kim. As you've already heard, he's with the Yonsei Institute of Sinology. But a little bit more on his background. He received a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Diplomacy from Yonsei University, a master's degree in Chinese modern history, and a PhD degree in international politics, both from Fudan University, and focuses mainly on U.S. China relations and its impact on the Korean Peninsula. Next to him is Dr. Hongjian Wang, currently a professor at the Department of Political Science at the National Chenggung University. He's also a deputy director at the Institute for National Policy Research. And he has a master's degree from the University of Denver, as well as Queen's University of Belfast, and a PhD from the University of Tübingen in Germany. And he focuses mainly on East Asian security. Next to him, we have Dr. Bonnie Lin, who's director of the China Power Project here at CSIS and also a senior fellow for Asian security. Previously, she worked at the RAND Corporation and also has a distinguished record of service in the U.S. government, in the U.S. Department of Defense. Dr. Lin holds a PhD in political science from Yale University, master's degree in Asian studies from the University of Michigan, and a bachelor's degree in government from Harvard College. Next to her is Dr. Jae-jung Kim, who's a professor of international relations and currently dean of the Graduate School of International Studies at Songang University. He's a political scientist, was trained at Yale University, has a master's in international relations and a PhD in political science, both from Yale. And then finally, last but not least, we have Dr. Chen-Yu Lee, who is is a chief economist at Taishin Financial Holdings and an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Economics at National Taiwan University, as well as a distinguished research fellow at the Institute for National Policy Research. And he earned his PhD in economics from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. So as you can tell just by that overview of their bios, we have a very robust set of expertise here on the stage, and we look forward to hearing their thoughts on the themes we're going to address today. I'll invite each of them to give opening presentations, and then we'll have a little dialogue among ourselves, and we'll reserve some time for questions from all of you. So without further ado, Dr. Dongchang Kim, please welcome. Look forward to your remarks.
Thank you. Recently, there are various security-related issues in the Indo-Pacific region, including North Korea's provocations and the increasing crisis in Taiwan Strait and territorial dispute in the East China Sea and South China Sea. However, each country has different positions on which security issue they perceive as a greater or impending threat. For example, the United States now seems to be most concerned about the possibility of a crisis in the Taiwan Strait. On the other hand, North Korea's nuclear and missile provocations are the biggest threat to South Korea. It's very difficult to decide which is objectively the most important security issue. However, from South Korea's point of view, the North Korean nuclear issue and growing provocation from North Korea in recent years are certainly the most important and impending security issues. Therefore, my presentation today will first emphasize that South Korea has long played an important role in maintaining peace and security in East Asia and Indo-Pacific region through defending North Korea's threat. And then I'll briefly explain how South Korea has contributed to maintain the peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region since the inauguration of the Yonsei government. And focusing on how to maintain peace and security on the Korean Peninsula, I would argue that more attention and support from the United States is needed on the North Korean nuclear issue. And lastly, I will make some comments on the crisis in the Taiwan Strait. I think South Korea has long played an important role in maintaining peace and security in the Indo-Pacific region. In particular, since President Yoon Suk-yeol took office in May last year, I think South Korea has made every possible effort to maintain peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. First of all, in December 2022, the Yoon Suk-yeol government announced Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy. In the Korean version of Indo-Pacific strategy, Yoon Suk-yeol government emphasized the importance of free, peaceful, and prosperous Indo-Pacific region and expressed support for the rule-based international order. At the same time, the Yoon Suk-yeol government emphasized inclusion and tolerance, noting that the Korean version of Indo-Pacific strategy would not exclude any particular country. The importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait was first mentioned in a joint statement of the 2021 ROK-US summit between then President Moon Jae-in and President Biden. And this was also mentioned again in the 2022 ROK-US summit between President Yoon Suk-yeol and President Biden. In addition, the Yoon Suk-yeol government resumed ROK-US joint military exercise that had been reduced or postponed during the COVID era. And the ROK-US joint military drills are expanding and strengthening to cope with the situation where North Korea's provocation become more frequent and hostile. More important measure is that Yoon Suk-yeol government has taken the initiative to improve relations with Japan to cope with the escalating threat from North Korea. Despite much controversy and concerns in South Korea, it remains to be seen how Japan will respond to this move. But it seems clear that the Yoon Suk-yeol government has set responding to threats from North Korea as the top goal of South Korea's foreign policy. After the U.S. China strategic competition intensified and Russia invaded Ukraine last year, the regional security situation in Northeast Asia has been creating the most favorable environment for North Korea since the end of Cold War. Taking advantage of this situation, North Korea continues to develop its nuclear and missile capabilities, while at the same time taking steps to use tactical nuclear weapons against South Korea in case of emergency. For example, North Korea legislated rules on conditions for preemptive use of nuclear weapons last year. In addition, the North Korean military also disclosed the status of unit training to operate tactical nuclear weapons. Please suppose there is a military conflict on the Korean Peninsula. This will not only have catastrophic consequences for South Korea, but also have serious security side effect for the entire East Asia. Therefore, maintaining peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula in response to threats from North Korea is very important factor in maintaining peace and stability throughout the Indo-Pacific region. And South Korea is working hard on this important mission with the utmost effort. And in order to complete this mission more successfully, the United States needs to show more interest in the North Korean nuclear issue and threat from North Korea, and to support South Korea. But unfortunately, according to Biden administration's national security strategy report and my talks with U.S. government officials or scholars, the U.S. seems to be not paying as much attention to the North Korean issues, nuclear issues, as South Korean ones. In contrast to the U.S. showing less interest in North Korea's nuclear weapons program or North Korea-related issues, the U.S. is showing great interest in what role South Korea will play in the situation of Taiwan Strait contingency. However, I think the United States should answer a few questions first before asking South Korea to answer this question. First, how is the United States evaluating the possibility that the crisis in the Taiwan Strait will turn into a military conflict? If the United States is concerned about the escalation of crisis in the Taiwan Strait, first of all, effort should be made to maintain peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait and prevent military conflict, just as South Korea is doing its best to maintain peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. Second, what will the United States do in the situation of the Taiwan Strait contingency? President Biden has expressed his position on this issue, on this question 4 times in an interview with the media, that the U.S. has commitment to defend Taiwan if China attacks. But the White House and the State Department immediately stressed that U.S. policy toward Taiwan has not changed. All scholars who participated in today's seminar will know well the reason why the United States maintains strategic ambiguity about Taiwan. However, as far as I know, there is no agreement within the United States on what the United States will do in the situation of the Taiwan Strait contingency. The U.S. will clarify first. The U.S. should clarify first how it will respond itself before asking how allies such as South Korea, Japan, and Philippines will respond to the Taiwan Strait contingency. Of course, in reality, the United States will not be able to give up its strategic ambiguity about Taiwan. Therefore, it will not be able to announce in advance what the United States will do in the situation of the Taiwan Strait contingency. If so, the U.S. should also allow the strategic ambiguity it enjoys to the other allies. Currently, it seems that Korea doesn't discuss what position Korea will take in the situation of the Taiwan Strait contingency. However, based on President Yoon Suk-yeol's response to this issue, South Korea will focus on thoroughly preventing North Korea from making military provocations against South Korea in the situation of Taiwan contingency. And in the current situation, I think all capabilities should be focused on preventing military conflicts from happening, whether it's on the Korean Peninsula or on the Taiwan Strait. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. Several stimulating comments. We'll come back to some of the themes you addressed. Dr. Wang, over to you, and I believe you have some slides to share with the audience. Welcome.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nick. Good morning, everyone. I'm Hong Wang from Taiwan, from IMPR. Actually, I prepared some slides for your reference. I think here's the background. Right now, we are facing two great powers competing with each other in Asia, but also around the world. That's another topic for discussing that if they are playing the same game or not, but at least I think they are pursuing their national interest and they have a different perspective or different definitions of power, interest, and democracy and so on. Even they have a different views on the how to have international order and the international different international systems. But I think that's all those Asia countries, including Taiwan, we are facing this security structure and the security environment so far in Asia. So that leads to our topic today. And actually, I have two broad questions, but I will focus more on the first part and touch upon a little bit the second issues. The two questions are, first, what should be the role of like-minded countries in security cooperations? I think that's the issues I would like to focus on, and all those Asia countries, including Taiwan, so far we are so concerned about in the face of the rising threat. And the second question would be, what are the specific issues or areas that like-minded countries can work together to enhance peace and the stability in the region? This is a more practical and policy-oriented issues. I think we should, all governments or politicians and practitioners, we should discuss more for our more practical issues and policy cooperations in the region. So in order to answer the first questions, I think we need to reflect on, first, what kind of role that like-minded countries have established for the security cooperation in Asia since at least the outbreak of the Korean War in the 1950s. The established one from a perspective is used to code as the San Francisco system or the hub and spokes system. It is a system made of bilateral political, military, and economic commitment between the United States and its Asia-Pacific allies, which has contributed to the current main architecture of Asia's security environment. I think the main problem here for this established architecture is that from the perspective of Asia countries, it relies too much on the U.S. power alone, U.S. capability alone. As long as the U.S. power is overstretched, such as the current situations, the U.S. current power projection in the Russia-Ukraine war, then I think the Asia countries will be suffering from the risk of facing potential rising threat from the leaders such as Chinese President Xi Jinping, who sees this situation as a good window of opportunity for them to challenge or to change the established system that they do not like for a long time. This would lead to my second point that I would like to raise here. By definition, as you see the right side of my slide, there's a definition, there's a concept called strategic ambiguity. This concept is defined as to describe how the U.S. government is intentionally ambiguous on its both China and Taiwan policies. However, I think this is a policy that can only work well when the leadership in three countries, United States, Taiwan, and South Korea, are considered based on rational calculations. But I think this is problematic because we miss the relational components among the triangle relations between the United States, Taiwan, and China, and other countries. In other words, the U.S.-Taiwan relationship and the U.S.-China relationship can never be equal, in which I believe trust has played a crucial role in making the differences. The U.S.-Taiwan relationship has become a friendship based on prior liberal values, while the U.S.-China relationship has been built upon a material base which was crushed, at least starting from the Trump administration. So what is more important here, I would like to argue, is that the original purpose of this concept of strategic ambiguity policy is to deter China from unilaterally changing the status quo by forces. And these purposes, however, has been obviously failed. So here goes to my next slide. I think we need to reflect on the above two mentioned points I just raised here, that are the current problematic Asia security structure and the out-of-dated practices of strategic ambiguity policy from the U.S. side. I'm not the first one to call for this reflection. And in fact, sometimes something is undergoing right now. For example, last month, when he visited Taiwan, John Bolton, the former national security advisor to former President Trump, threw out the idea of making up a collective self-defense group for Asia countries that includes Taiwan. I think this is not a crazy idea, because not a long time ago, some analysis even suggested that the need for building an Asia version of NATO. Whether this Asia version of NATO or an idea of a collective self-defense group will finally come true or not, at least the initiative of such idea will compel Chinese leaders to think twice now if they want to take any offensive actions toward Taiwan or toward other neighbors. Similarly, like-minded countries in Asia will have to start to think about how to take care with each other in security cooperation and policy coordination, regardless of their historical disputes. Second, actually, that's the second point from the right side of my slide. We are recently witnessing to the micro change of U.S.-Taiwan policy from ambiguity to clarity. Actually, this point is also raised by Dr. Kim just a few minutes ago. President Biden at least mentioned 4 times in the front of the public media that the U.S. forces will defend Taiwan in the case of Chinese invasion. It is not the point here whether the U.S. government will finally do it or not. I think what is more important is why the U.S. leadership reveals such an intention different from the conventional diplomatic rhetoric. In my view, this is because the U.S. leadership may have realized that the policy of ambiguity would be leading to an appeasement or a disaster that will give Chinese leaders a wrong message that the U.S. will not confront China by forces directly in any cases. I believe the more unambiguous the U.S. policy is about Taiwan, the more problematic it is for Chinese leaders to take risky military actions, and the more stable the Taiwan Strait status quo may be maintained. And because of the time limitations, so I think I was intended to answer the second question in what areas that actually Asia countries, like-minded countries, we can cooperate with each other. But I think after probably there are several fields such that I mentioned in this PowerPoint, military area, economic area, and the security areas. I would like to skip that part. I think what is most important things here is those challenges that we are facing for the security cooperations in the military, economy, and security areas. I think we need to think twice. What does the concept of like-minded countries refer to? For me, to be straightforward, if the like-minded countries do include Taiwan, then we need to admit that the success of all like-minded countries in working together fundamentally relies on to what extent the individual countries could resist on China's one China principle pressure and the following up self-restrained actions toward Taiwan from the individual countries. So I will stop here. Maybe we can talk about this later when we open to the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. And we'll definitely come back and give you an opportunity to share your thoughts on opportunities for cooperation. But I do detect a trend. We have concerns about U.S. commitment to the Korean Peninsula. We've heard two presenters address the strategic ambiguity related to Taiwan. We're going to come back to that in the discussion. And maybe Bonnie, if you could react to some of those concerns, that would be great. But I think I'm going to invite our other guests to speak and let you react to their comments at the end. So next, Dr. Jae-Chun Kim, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick. First of all, I must say that I am truly honored to be a part of this important venue. As far as I remember, as Dr. Cha said in the beginning of the session, this is the first time for scholars from South Korea, the U.S., and Taiwan to get together and to hold an event like this. I think this is the first time, but I certainly do not believe that this is going to be the last time. I prepared 3 points, very brief 3 points. So I'm going to talk about these 3 points, but without the order of importance, without the descending order of importance. I'll start with the status of ROC-US alliance and also the status of trilateral cooperation between the US, South Korea, and, Japan, not this time Taiwan, the trilateral cooperation that is shaping up in Northeast Asian region, majorly between South Korea, the US, and Japan. After witnessing ROC-US summit that took place around 2 weeks ago, right, here in Washington, D.C., I was
under the impression that the alliance is truly morphing into a comprehensive strategy, global level alliance. I mean, we agreed. I mean, in South Korea and the U.S. agreed a long time ago that we will be updating the alliance into a global strategy comprehensive partnership. I mean, think about the summit that took place between the U.S. and South Korea exactly 2 years ago in Washington, D.C. That time it was between President Moon Jae-in and President Joe Biden. After the summit, a very extensive joint statement came out. And the joint statement specified all these measures with which we can upgrade the alliance into a global comprehensive strategy partnership. But that said, toward the end of his tenure, President Moon Jae-in, our former President Moon Jae-in, was pretty much preoccupied with the, his efforts to declare an end to the Korean War. So there hadn't been any serious follow-throughs, in my personal opinion. But President Yoon Suk-yeol is more serious about doing follow-throughs. That, I think, is one of the reasons why the alliance is really morphing into a truly global level comprehensive strategic partnership, which is a good thing, in my personal opinion. Trilateral cooperation between the three countries, South Korea, the U.S., and Japan, is moving into the right direction. You guys all know that President Yoon had to, he went, a great length to restore, South Korea's relationship with Japan that hit the rock bottom in past 5 to 6 years. I think it really hit the rock bottom. I think it was a good thing for South Korea to make the first move, because it was the previous South Korean government that reneged on a comfort women agreement. And when the controversial court ruling came out about the compensating, forced, these victims of forced labor during the, during Japanese colonial period, I mean, the previous South Korean government pretty much adopted this, what I would call, hands-off approach to this ruling. So I think, overall it was the right thing for South Korea to have made this first move, but that, the first labor victim solution prepared by Yoon Suk-yeol, President Yoon, was very controversial domestically. In terms of domestic politics, it was a very controversial, because the solution pretty much exonerated Japanese government and Japanese companies from this obligation to compensate these victims of forced labor. That said, it did jumpstart summit between the two countries, and it did jumpstart shuttle diplomacy that had been stalled for more than 10 years. Was it 12 years? So I think it was a good thing for the Yoon government put in good faith efforts to restore the relations between South Korea and Japan as a result. I mean, I think it has, I think it resulted in strengthening the relationship between the U.S. and South Korea. I mean, the last summit was quite successful, in my personal opinion. All these substantial outcomes came out, such as declaring Washington Declaration, in my personal opinion, was quite successful, and the agreement to launch a nuclear consultative group is quite promising. All these substantial outcomes came out because Yoon's efforts to restore relationship, manned offensives with Japan sort of preceded before the summit. I certainly believe that improving trilateral cooperation between these three countries will help strengthen our deterrence capabilities against, not just against North Korea, but also in case contingency over the Taiwan Strait erupts. I think strengthened trilateral cooperation between these three countries will be very helpful. So my second point is about Taiwan contingency and Korean Peninsula contingency. I believe that these two contingencies are very much closely related to each other. So first, I think it is my argument. I argue that it is very important to maintain effective deterrence against North Korea to prevent Taiwan contingency from arising. Why is that? Why is that? If North Korea creates a crisis on the Korean Peninsula, this can also open a window of opportunity for China to aggress toward Taiwan, because the U.S. will have to deal with Korean Peninsula situation, right? So China might be tempted to take advantage of this situation, the contingent situation on the Korean Peninsula. These are purely hypothetical situations. I'm not saying that China will be invading Taiwan, but this is a scenario that we'll have to weigh in. That's for sure. I mean, this is my personal view. I'm not really speaking for South Korean government. In no way I am representing South Korean government here. These are purely my personal views, but this is a likely scenario that we'll have to weigh in. And I think the opposite is also true. If Taiwan contingency erupts, the U.S. will have to respond to Taiwan Strait contingency, right? So this could make South Korea very vulnerable, and North Korea might take advantage of the situation. North Korea specifically warned if the U.S. supports Taiwan in case of Taiwan contingency, there will be tragic consequences and ramifications. I mean, this is the wording used by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in North Korea. Okay? So, I think this is one of the reasons why Yoon government, actually President Yoon himself, went great length and said that it is very important. I mean, he opposes any unilateral change of status quo on the Taiwan Strait by force. Why? Because Taiwan contingency can adversely affect security situation on the Korean Peninsula. It could undermine security of South Korea. Okay? So it is in our core national interests to oppose any unilateral change of status quo on the Taiwan Strait by force. So we have friends from Taiwan today, American friends. I think it is very important for us to have a very serious discussion on how we can strengthen deterrence on the Korean Peninsula and also on the Taiwan Strait. And we have to discuss how we can strengthen our deterrence against North Koreans and how we can strengthen deterrence on the Taiwan Strait in conjunction with each other, because they are very much closely related with each other. My last point is about economic security. I do believe that it is important for like-minded countries to work together, work very closely on issues related to economic security, on matters related to supply chain resilience policies. Okay. That said, there is a growing perception in South Korea and in other allies of the U.S. that the U.S. supply chain policy is discriminating to South Korea and other allies and South Korean companies. Why are we doing this supply chain resilience policies? Because we believe that China is not playing by the rule. But the question arises, is the U.S. really playing by the rule in supply chain policy? Is there a rule-based order in the U.S. supply chain policy? So such negative perception could incite anti-American sentiment, say, in South Korea, in which case this perception could eventually do irreparable damage to the alliance. As I said, it's a good thing. It's a good thing that the alliance is expanding into comprehensive strategic partnership, but if the expansion of expanded scope of cooperation on economic security is viewed unfair, if it is viewed as non-reciprocal, it could do real damage to the alliance down the road. I like the concept collective resilience. I think this term was first coined by Bonnie Glaser, now with the German Marshall Fund. It was, our Dr. Cha also utilized that concept in recent Foreign Affairs article. I mean, we have to be resilient together, not just the United States. We have to be resilient. The alliance partners of the U.S. will have to be resilient together. I think that's the concept of collective resilience. The slogan for the ROC-US alliance has been, we go together, 같이 갑시다, we go together. From now on, I suggest another slogan for ROC-US alliance, which is, we be resilient together. I don't know how I can say that in Korean language, but we be resilient together. So on that note, I conclude my remark. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. Dr. Lee, picking up on the economic theme, maybe you could share your perspective from an economist's view, and I believe you also have some slides, so please.
Yes, thank you. Can you put my slides? First, I have to apologize. I have too many slides. So maybe we just browse the slides very quickly. I'm going to start from the page 8. So first one, you can see the China support its tech companies to become the superpower, and U.S. China competition reunited Indo-Pacific countries. Together, you can see a lot of pictures. And FTA with China actually didn't benefit Korea much. At least recently, you can see the deficit of the Korea. And actually, this is the turning point. Taiwan and Korea found competitor to partner is happening. And Taiwan and Korea can strengthen cooperation. So I'm going to start from this page. So actually, Taiwan is decoupling from China, but at a very slow pace. The proof is you can see the ratio of triangle trade. The triangle trade is the definition from the economics. It means there are a lot of companies in Taiwan, they receive their export orders in Taiwan, but they pass the order to their factories in China and do the production in China. You can see that this ratio dropped from 50% to 42%. It's significant, but the number is still very big. You can see the top left graph. And right now, if you ask any Taiwanese businessman where you're gonna start up your new factories, right now they are considering returning back to Taiwan or setting up new factories in Southeast Asia. But if you ask Taiwanese businessmen, have you have any expansion plan? More than 30% of the manufacturers of Taiwan companies, they still want to expand their production in mainland China, especially in some specific industry like optical, machinery, electronic products, plastics, and basic metals. I really think there are two ways to get rid of China's threat. And one way is you can cut the connection with China very quickly. I call it shock therapy. The other way, you can gradually leave China. I call it slow decoupling. The advantage of shock therapy is you can get rid of China's threat as soon as possible, right? But the disadvantage is you can cause a huge impact on world economy, like you can prolong the inflation of the whole world. if you use the other way, like a slow decoupling, or we call it China plus one, the advantage is the cost may be lower, but you have take time. It takes time. It may take many, many years, and sometimes it gives the China the opportunity to defeat you in various ways. But the worst scenario, the problem with the United States right now is United States is using shock therapy on the political side, but slow decoupling on the economy side. It makes people confused. And it also can lead a conflict between these methods. So that's why there are a lot of people say, oh, maybe U.S. won't abide his own rule or something. And of course, if we want to get rid of China threat, India is very important. India is the key to global supply chain resilience. India needs to be ready as soon as possible. However, if we see the top 20 container ports, India have no ports included, top 20. India's largest ports ranked 28th and 31st. And 7 of top 10 ports are still from China. That means it's still a long way to go for India to replace China to be the world factory. So I think maybe like G7, Korea or Taiwan or a lot of countries, we need to provide more funding to India to have them improve their infrastructure, to attract companies, switch their supply chain from China to India. I think it's the key idea. And last 2 pages, I want to talk about the relationship between United States and Taiwan. First one, I really think United States should upgrade a U.S.-Taiwan relationship to the factor comprehensive strategic partnership. Right now, U.S. treats Taiwan in a fragmented way. How to say that? It's kind of like a individual state go to attract individual companies in Taiwan to invest in the individual state. For example, like Arizona with TSMC, like Texas with the Formosa Plastic Group, like Wisconsin with Foxconn. But if you see how United States treat South Korea, United States treats South Korea as a really good friend, as a close political and trade partner. Federal government is leading effort to attract comprehensive investment from South Korea, not individual state to individual company. So I really think or suggest U.S. can consider to treat Taiwan in a similar way, And moreover, I think we should focus more on the tangible cooperations. For example, right now I know the U.S.-Taiwan initiative on 21st century trade negotiation is undergoing. Of course, it's great, but this agreement largely focuses on the conceptual consistency or technical benefits such as trade facilitation. It's small part. If we want to really deepen the relationship, the trade relationship between U.S. and Taiwan, I think U.S. should provide some tax incentives, like sign the U.S.-Taiwan tax agreement, like avoid the double taxation. Actually, these discussions has been going for long time. Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen, American institution at Taiwan, AIT, American Chamber of Commerce in Taiwan has been calling for it, but the US government just ignore it. Just ignore it. So, except CHIP Act, except TSMC investment at Arizona, I think the US should treat Taiwan in a better way to make Taiwanese people and Taiwan government more willing to stand with United States together. This is my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Appreciate that. Bonnie, let's turn to you. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nick. And really delighted to be here on this very important panel with colleagues from both Korea as well as Taiwan. And I wanted to echo what Victor and others had said of how important this type of engagement, this type of dialogue is. Instead of trying to introduce a lot more issues in this discussion, I wanted to maybe take my time to address some of the points that were raised very well by my colleagues and maybe provide at least my perspective on some of those issues. So I wanted to first go with Dr. Kim's point, which you mentioned that your perception is the United States is much more concerned about the crisis in the Taiwan Strait versus North Korea. And I think that you definitely see that from the media narrative, but when I look at, for example, what our Department of Defense has done, thinking about the North Korean contingency, I don't think that you could say that we haven't thought through all the different ways of how to deal with the North Korean contingency and have not worked with South Korea very, very closely on this. And potentially not only South Korea on North Korean contingencies. I would also mention maybe some of the perception of why Taiwan is given more focus is based off of 2 issues. One is a threat actor, right? At least from the US perspective, China is a much more challenging threat, a global threat, and not just a security threat. China poses also significant economic challenges, as Dr. Lee was mentioning, across the board. So when we look at the actors, I think sometimes people associate the crisis with the actor, and clearly from the US perspective, China is much more of a challenge than North Korea is on a global scale. The other thing I would note is looking at how prepared, particularly our key allies and partners are, and I would say South Korea is probably very prepared to deal with North Korean contingencies, whereas we really need to work with Taiwan quite a bit. So that might create some of the perception that the United States is much more focused on Taiwan and not as focused on North Korea. But I would argue that if you put it in the context of the overall China challenge and how prepared our allies and partner is, it gives a little bit of a flavor that we are focused on both contingencies and we're not valuing the threat that North Korea poses. I wanted to also talk a bit about what you raised in terms of the Ukraine impact on the security environment. I thought it was an excellent point you raised in terms of how the conflict in Ukraine has actually provided a more favorable environment for North Korea, particularly given how China and Russia are acting in that conflict. And I want to point out that it's actually potentially the opposite for China when it comes to Taiwan. Right? In many ways, the Ukraine conflict has increased global support for Taiwan. So in that respect, the impact of the conflict is a little bit different when you look at the different contingencies. It's probably made it more difficult for China to think about use of force against Taiwan, but potentially it may have created a little bit more room for North Korea vis-a-vis South Korea. But I do wonder, and this goes to some of the issues that were discussed about, are there potentially similar lessons learned between China and North Korea about the utility of nuclear weapons? And maybe even if the environment is not perceived the same as a result of Ukraine, it probably is troubling from a defense perspective and sitting in the United States, looking at what lessons both countries might be learning with respect to how nuclear weapons could be used in either a Korean contingency or a Taiwan contingency. I wanted to cover briefly on strategic ambiguity, which was an issue raised by a couple of folks on the panel. I just wanted to clarify that yes, President Biden has said on multiple occasions that the United States would defend Taiwan, but I would encourage folks to actually go back and look at the exact statement that President Biden said. Usually he caveats the Chinese attack with something, like an unprecedented Chinese attack. Basically, I think our position on the U.S. side is relatively clear that if the attack on Taiwan by China is unprovoked, clearly at fault of China, it's very clear that probably the United States and many others from the international community would stand with Taiwan. And that relates to going back to the history of why we have strategic ambiguity. I think in the recent years, we've been less concerned about Taiwan. We've had absolutely phenomenal partnership with President Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan. But if you look further back in history, when we think about cross-strait dynamics and U.S. policy towards Taiwan, as well as China, it's been about dual deterrence, right? It's been about not only preventing China from invading and attacking Taiwan, but also in some cases preventing Taiwan from taking significant action such as a declaration of independence that could, in many ways, destabilize cross-strait relations and represent a change in the status quo. So I think it's still important to mention that U.S. cross-strait policy still has an element of how do we prevent both sides of the strait from unilaterally changing the dynamics to contribute to cross-strait instability as well as conflict. I would also note that what is interesting would be to follow closely how Ukraine is impacting China's assessments of U.S. ability or willingness to defend Taiwan. In the past couple of weeks, I've been hearing more from some Chinese scholars that one potential lesson learned, and I don't know if this is a lesson learned that's resonated all the way up at the highest levels in Beijing, or there's just some views from independent scholars in China, is that there's more concern that because the United States did not intervene and send forces into Ukraine, that there's some, because of Russia's nuclear signaling, there are some Chinese scholars who wonder whether the United States would be willing to do so vis-a-vis Taiwan. And that also might explain a bit more of why this administration feels the need to emphasize our support to Taiwan now, because there's this narrative going out that the United States could be deterred from conventional intervention because of nuclear threats. And when you apply that in the case of Taiwan, then some folks might question, would the United States even be willing? So I think we need to put President Biden's comments in that larger context of a greater sense of among some elements, a greater sense of questioning about what is the U.S. Role and how does U.S. view the Taiwan situation. I wanted to comment a little bit on Dr. Wang, your mentioning of sort of the U.S. Thinking about our security arrangement with the Indo-Pacific. You mentioned the hub and spokes model. What I would note is I think what this administration, as well as what prior U.S. administrations have been doing, is moving beyond that model, right? We're constructing mini-laterals. We're working on whether that's the Quad, whether that we've been talking about U.S. Japan ROK trilateral. Many of these smaller arrangements are making sure that the model, the architecture in the Indo-Pacific isn't just hub and spokes. And many of these arrangements is in many ways, when we think about it, could be leveraged to support Taiwan in the future. So I would just encourage folks to not forget that we are doing significant efforts with our allies and partners. And the last thing I will mention, I know I'm probably running a little bit over time, is when we think about the tension between strategic ambiguity as well as building the largest coalition of like-minded countries, I did want to flag what I saw was a little bit of tension between Dr. Wang, your remarks, and Dr. Kim's remarks, right? Where Dr. Kim suggested that it would be easier for the ROK to operate if the ROK could maintain strategic ambiguity on your willingness to support Taiwan or not. And Dr. Wang, you mentioned it would be better for the United States to clarify and support Taiwan. I think from the U.S. perspective, if we're thinking about the most support we can provide Taiwan, in some ways, it's easier to get our allies and partners on board to provide support for Taiwan if there is a little bit more room for them to wiggle, right? Whereas if we stated very clearly, this is how we're going to support Taiwan, and these are exactly the ways, for example, South Korea, we would want to support Taiwan, I would think that would be a little more difficult for a number of countries, not just South Korea, to think about its own positioning on Taiwan. And I'll just conclude by saying that I very much want to echo the remarks that this Dr. Kim mentioned with respect to thinking about the various linking the Taiwan contingencies and North Korea contingencies. And I think there's a lot of issue areas that we still need to parse out much more clearly in terms of opportunism, right? Do we see in a potential North Korean contingency Chinese opportunism, and or could we see North Korean opportunism during a potential Taiwan contingency? I think right now the conventional or the more widespread view within the United States is that it's more likely that we will see a North Korean opportunism in a China-Taiwan contingency, but not so much the other. But that's why hearing your views and the views of leading scholars from South Korea and Taiwan on this issue is incredibly important, because we need to be able to dissect how exactly are these two contingencies linked. What ways do we see opportunism rising, or what ways might we see horizontal escalation by one actor over the other? And based on an assessment of the common threat environment, common pathways to potential conflict, then we can talk about how exactly our three sides can work together. But I think the first step is getting on the same page on what is actually the assessment of the linkages between the two contingencies. So I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Bonnie. So many excellent comments. We could spend a lot of time digging deeply into each of them. But let me just ask a few follow-up questions and let you to react to each other, and then we'll give you all a chance to jump in as well. Dong-Chang, question for you. I was struck by your comment that the United States doesn't pay enough attention to the Korean Peninsula. From my point of view, the recent UN-Biden summit was a very robust demonstration of that commitment, especially with respect to U.S. Extended deterrence commitments, an attempt to reassure the South Korean people about how strong the U.S.-ROK alliance is, and then very concrete list of initiatives, joint training, more exercises to demonstrate that the U.S.-ROK alliance is becoming more integrated than ever in response to the North Korean threat. So what is it that the United States is not doing or saying with respect to North Korea from your point of view? If you could just elaborate on that.
Okay, thank you for your question. After the summit of 2 weeks ago, if there is some, we can say that there is some progress on this issue, but from the perspective of Koreans, for example, last October, I have a chance to visit Pentagon and State Department. At the time, I was shocked that even officials who are in charge of Korean Peninsula, they asked us only Taiwan issue. They didn't ask us Korean issue. North Korean issue. That's first one. That's my impression of this issue. And second one is that I mentioned in my presentation there is a big differences between U.S. and Korea on these security-related issues. So, for example, even though make some progresses through the summit between President Yoon Suk-yeol and President Biden, that's true. But many Koreans still think that it's not that enough. It's not gave us enough relief or enough safety. So my another example is that maybe you study Korean issue, then you should know that a newspaper called 조선일보, right? It's a very representative media, standing on conservative position, right? And do you know that right now, who are support for Korea's making nuclear weapons is from the 조선일보. So it means that Korean, some conservatives feels that it's not enough to defend Korea without our own nuclear weapon. So I think there is some progress, but many Koreans expect more tangible measures to let Koreans feel more safe from the United States.
Appreciate that. I think you make an important point that initiatives matter in demonstrating the strength of alliances, but perceptions also matter. So clearly, a lot of follow-up is in store.
We should do more things to do.
Sure, sure, absolutely. But go ahead, Jason.
That's just the nature of extended deterrence to me. I mean, you're a provider of extended deterrence, and you feel that you gave like 95% of what you have. But if you are a beneficiary of extended deterrence, you always feel that comes a little short because it's not your. But if you are a party that is being deterred, I mean, in this case, it's North Korea. They feel very threatened. So overall, I think these measures that came out from the summit was pretty palpable. And I do believe that it'll increase our deterrent capability against North Korea. But it's, as you said, I mean, deterrence is a function of capability and also will. And we do believe that the U.S. has capability, that's for sure. But when it comes to the question of whether the U.S. is willing to use nuclear weapons, we have a bit of doubt. I mean, it all comes down to the perception of South Koreans. And when it used to be nuclear umbrella, it was very intuitive. We are under the U.S. nuclear umbrella, and then we feel safe. It was replaced by extended deterrence. It's a little bit ambiguous to many South Korean people, even these econ professors who are well versed in current affairs, and they say, come to me and, what the hell is extended deterrence? Can you explain to me? So it's not that intuitive. So the reason why South Koreans, even the one who is in charge of running South Korean security policy, wants to call it Korean type nuclear sharing program because it's more intuitive. But there's no such a thing as nuclear sharing. We all know that, right? I mean, NATO's nuclear sharing program is not really sharing nuclear weapons per se. I mean, it's sharing the obligation to have some kind of control over the those weapons deployed in Europe, delivery, and they do hold these exercises. That's for sure to, for these jet fighters to deliver these weapons. But I mean, it's the perception. So I'm very curious the next public opinion poll that'll come out soon, whether South Koreans are not really calling for our own nuclear weapons development. But I think, I mean, the number will not really decrease significantly. I think a significant number of South Koreans will still want South Korea to go nuclear. It's just the nature of extended deterrence. So I don't know. Yeah, I mean, that's my 2 cents. Yeah.
I actually have a question. So I was wondering, is this perception that the United States is not doing enough on North Korea, particularly on the nuclear issue, is that actually driven by the conflict in Ukraine, by perception that because we did not send conventional forces into Ukraine, but also the lessons learned North Korea is taking from Ukraine and being more willing to use nuclear weapons? Is this a new sentiment, or is this what drives this feeling?
We are saying that U.S. is not doing enough. I mean, just North Korean nuclear weapons has become less of a priority to the U.S. foreign policy makers because in the front seat you have China and then Taiwan. Mm-hmm. That's for sure. So, and there is no real solution to nuclear weapons problems in North Korea. I mean, it's really a country of a lousy policy option. So that I think pretty much explains the sentiment shared by South Korea. It just took the backseat during the Biden administration, North Korean nuclear weapons issue.
So, Dr. Wang, I'm going to turn Bonnie's comment on your presentation into a question. Sensed some concern on your part about U.S. forward presence in the region and the perception that perhaps efforts to strengthen deterrence are failing or might have already failed. But as Bonnie pointed out, there is a robust network being developed, building on bilateral alliances, but also trilaterals and other mechanisms to develop habits of cooperation, to support regional stability. And in the maritime domain, of course, open sea lines of communication to sustain economic prosperity and secure future prosperity in the region. So could you expand on those concerns? What is it about U.S. strategy in the Indo-Pacific that you find lacking?
I think of course, I appreciate Bonnie's comment on my point. Actually, that's the one that I try to emphasize because we noticed that there is the established Asia security architecture, and we have this idea in the textbooks to teach students that this structure has been built up since the 1915s because of the outbreak of the Korean War. But we found that, actually I also found that the system has been changed. So of course I agree with Bonnie that right now we see this kind of a mini multiple security framework in Asia, such as Quad and other security dialogue between United States, Australia, India, and Japan. But there's some problem here because first one is that Taiwan is never to be included in such a security framework. So that's kind of the issue that Taiwan's voices or concerns when we are facing the rising threat from China, because we are so close and we understand the Chinese government. We understand the culture, we understand their political intentions, but our voices cannot be included. At least, I know we cannot do publicly, but according to my information, kind of we are excluded from this framework. So that's one point. I think something need to be improved more from the U.S. side or from our Asian neighbors. And the second, I think it's not enough is that all these security frameworks, such as Quad and other security dialogues among Asian countries and the United States, it's all based on contingent cases. And we have Trump administration before Biden administrations. So the Trump adopted the former Japanese Prime Minister Abe's idea about this Indo-Pacific idea, Indo-Pacific security, Indo-Pacific idea. But before that, we have other presidents, they have these Asia-Pacific ideas. I mean, we just changed the names. So far, we, of course, the Biden administration following up these Indo-Pacific ideas to try to coordinate its traditional, conventional Asia partners to build up this line. But we have to admit that there are two weaknesses here. The first weakness is that we don't know if Biden will be re-elected next year or not. You know, that's the problem democratic countries we face because we have this election in the party rotations. But the Chinese leaders, they don't have these limitations on their terms. So we expect that President Xi Jinping will be in his position probably forever as long as he is healthy. So that's one issue. The point here is that the Chinese government, they can be patient, they can have these consistent policies. But in comparisons in United States, U.S. is a vibrant democratic country. So you have party competitions, but within the domestic issues, different parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, they disagree with each other. Even if so far we see they have some kind of a minimal consensus on China issues. But I think, I mean, Chinese leaders, they know that you will change your government next year or eventually. So they expect that they can persuade the new leaders from the United States to be have a good relationship with the Chinese government again. So I don't think that's that's kind of the weakness. Probably that's the weakness of the democratic countries, but I don't know how to fix that, but that's the issues. And the second weakness is that even so far we see this mini multilateral security framework, but among Asia allies, we still have some historical disputes. Of course, for myself, I am happy to see that recently South Korea and Japan, they finally work together. But I think Chinese government, they know that we can have these divided strategies to attack on or to engage with those Western countries or as well as Asia allies from the United States side because they know that you still have some issues would be, is always there, is a historical issues. So they can deal with individual Asia countries in order to divide this Western line or security framework. And finally, I would like to argue that so far we didn't see any concrete policy or strategies from Quad or from other mini multilateral frameworks. It's always the idea. You have these big pictures promoted by the United States and the Asia countries, including Taiwan. So we are asked to cooperate, but it's always the big pie, it's there, it's good for us to pursue, but we didn't see the concrete in details how we can work together in the long run, not in a short term or in a contingent basis. So that's my opinion. Thank you.
Thanks. Let me respond briefly to all three of your perceived weaknesses and then turn to some of our colleagues. I certainly appreciate your point about domestic politics in the United States being a variable with respect to sustained commitment in the Indo-Pacific. But I would flip that around and say that as a result of former Prime Minister Abe's concerted effort to frame a strategy in the region around the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, we have the United States, Australia, India, ASEAN countries, and partners and allies in Europe developing their own free and Indo-Pacific strategies, recognizing that it's the hub of dynamism in the international system, and that we all have a shared interest in preventing conflict and maintaining prosperity in that part of the world. So I would suggest that even if U.S. politics might create a perception in the region of distraction or relatively less attention in the future, there are so many U.S. allies and partners that have embraced this as a concept that they will carry that agenda forward and keep the United States connected to the region. So that's the brilliance of the free and open Indo-Pacific, is that we're all coordinating, we're all talking about our shared concerns and our shared interests. And that will keep the U.S. bond to the Indo-Pacific strong, no matter what happens in our domestic politics.
Yeah. May I interrupt you? I think that's a good open forum for Western allies led by United States. But as a political scientist, we learn from the textbook that there's always a problem for collective actions. So we are facing authoritarian resistance, authoritarian resilience. And China and Russia actually, they work together. There are only two actors, but we are so many actors. And there's always a problem within these big alliances. Just give you one example. After French President Macron visits Beijing, then he has this interview, try to claim that European countries and as well as France, they are pursuing or they need this strategic autonomy from the United States. I mean, I know that after these disputed rhetoric, diplomatic world interviews, we have Joe Biden and Macron, they try to understand each other through the phone call. But the Chinese the Beijing, the Chinese leaders, they know that this is the window of opportunities to divide the Western alliances. So we always a problem, and that's a good side for us to have diverse voices. But that's also the weakness from our side when Chinese people, Chinese leaders, they see as their chance to be avoiding from the pressures from the Western side. So that's my response. Thank you.
Appreciate that. I'm sure we could carry on a dialogue on that topic alone, but let's table that as a theme for our next trilateral conversation because it's really fascinating. But I want to turn to two of our other colleagues, and then Bonnie, again, you can play the wrap-up role, and then we'll turn to the audience. Dr. Lee, I was struck by your comment that the United States is using shock therapy politically with respect to U.S. China strategic competition, but it's only decoupling slowly, and that causes confusion. I want to ask about a potential source of shock therapy on the economic side, which is collective responses to Chinese coercion, something Dr. Cha has written about and, in fact, testified about in our Congress earlier this week. Do you think that identifying products on which China is dependent and sort of coordinating action with respect to responses to Chinese economic coercion is a form of shock therapy? Do you think that would be beneficial in the region? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, actually, you can think back to like 2018, right before the trade war. Right before the trade war, Trump started trade war in I think it's the 2018 June. Right before the trade war, you can see it, all over the world economies gonna say, if you start a trade war, the inflation gonna booming and like a very, very, very big inflation. But what happened? Nothing happened. This inflation is not because of the trade war, right? This inflation is because of the COVID and it prints too much money. And so I think shock therapy would be I think it could be a good way to try it. It's not always like because right now you kind of use the shock therapy on the political side, but if you ask people to leave China, switch to India, but always someone lobby, his lobby is very popular in DC, and lobby you and say, okay, I'm giving you one more year, 2 more years, 3 more years. So the shock therapy never works. But if you think about yeah, I have to say that we economists' estimation never works in the long time. So you don't worry about what the economists say. Our estimation is always correct after what happened. So I think the most important thing is you have to keep your policy consistent, no matter which part you're gonna switch, but you have to keep it consistent. For example, you say, okay, after 5 years, after 10 years, I'm gonna set up a restriction on the products. If the product contains more than 30% which are produced in China, I'm never let import this product. You have to set up some rule and just execute it. This is my 2 cents.
Economic security, another theme we should explore together in the future. J.H., let me turn to you. You and Dr. Wang made references to Japan-Korea relations, and so I can't resist the opportunity to jump in on that briefly, and then I'd like to ask you another question about in reaction to your presentation. So I commend President Yoon for his efforts. I think both he and Prime Minister Kishida are taking political risks to advance the Japan-Korea relationship. It's interesting, nothing that Korea does vis-a-vis Japan is necessarily popular domestically. Nothing that Japan does vis-a-vis South Korea is necessarily popular domestically. But I think we need to commend both leaders for facing those political headwinds in advance of a strategic objective, which gets back to a comment Dr. Wang made, which is that we need to demonstrate that China cannot drive a wedge between our alliance network in Asia. So it's critically significant, and I think it will lead to a lot of creative initiatives, both between those two countries and also trilaterally with the United States. So both of them should be commended for taking this step, and certainly look forward to progress in the weeks and months ahead. My question for you, though, is from your presentation, where you very interestingly said that China might take advantage of a North Korean provocation to threaten Taiwan in some way, maybe short of conflict. That's very interesting, because much of the narrative in Washington is about North Korea taking advantage of a Taiwan contingency, and you flipped that around. So could you just elaborate a little bit on your concern about what type of action China might take?
I mean, it could cut both ways. As I said during my presentation, I mean, a contingent situation over Taiwan Strait will be a temptation for North Korea to strike against South Korea. But I'm not really sure whether North Korea will be that audacious to actually invade South Korea, or would create some significant commotion on the Korean peninsula. Your question was, I'm sorry, the chair was getting a little bit comfortable, and I'm still heavily jet lagged. And what kind of action could China take in case to Taiwan or to Taiwan? Geez, I don't know. I don't know, but I don't think the international community, what I can say is that it was possible for Russia, Putin to cross the Dnieper River, but I don't think the international community will allow for China to cross the Taiwan Strait. That's, I mean, they'll be very much tempted to cross the Taiwan Strait, but I don't think that'll happen. I don't know the specific kinds of actions that China could take to aggress toward Taiwan, but that'll certainly present an opportunity. I mean, really, a contingent situation on the Korean peninsula will create an opportunity for China to exploit the situation and aggress toward Taiwan, and likewise, the flip side is that, you know, contingent situation in Taiwan over Taiwan Strait will create this opportunity for North Korea to exploit that situation. That's all right. So specific actions, I'm not really sure. Yeah.
Appreciate you flagging that. Bonnie, anything you'd like to say in conclusion?
Maybe I could, as you were asking him the question, I was thinking about in what extreme scenario we might see that. And there's only one very, very extreme scenario that I can imagine is in an actual Korean contingency where China has already intervened on the war on behalf of North Korea. This is a very, very extreme scenario. I don't think it's that likely. But in the event that China assesses it's already in an all-out war, would it then assess, well, if we're already in this conflict, could there be additional incentives to, well, why don't we just finish everything? But again, I don't think that's very likely. I think it's very extreme. But that's the only scenario I can think of in which China would want to increase pressure around Taiwan around that same time, or use force around Taiwan, mainly because basically China would be allowing North Korea to set the pace of what it wants for its Taiwan policy. But that assumes that China has really strengthened relations with North Korea. That assumes that China's relations with the United States has really gone down south. So I think it's a very, very extreme scenario. But one of the things we do have to think about, particularly as defense planners, is we can't just rule out extreme scenarios, right? We do have to think about how likely they are, and then think about planning. I also wanted to talk to maybe jump a little bit on what Dr. Wong was talking about in terms of the perception of U.S. failed deterrence. I think depending on how you think about what U.S. should be responsible for in terms of deterring Chinese aggression against Taiwan, one could make the case on the gray zone side. China has not been deterred from using demonstrations of military force against Taiwan. But that raises the question, is that the U.S. responsibility, or should Taiwan be taking the lead there? And I think that's a longer conversation to be had in terms of what role Taiwan should play in your own deterrence versus the United States. But I would say that it is probably true to say that looking at particularly recent China's military exercise this April and China's large-scale military exercise last August, China does feel that it has the ability to engage in large-scale exercises around Taiwan. And to date, China has not suffered any direct major punishment. So I think that is important to flag. Yeah, thank you.
Well, great. It's been a fascinating discussion. We're almost at time, but maybe we can take one question from the audience, if anyone would like to chime in. Please, just identify yourself and ask a question. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. My name is Min Yu. I am the adjunct professor of translation at Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, and by training, I am an interpreter and translator. I have a question following up on economic security, probably directing to Dr. Lee. Just last week, the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, testified at the Senate about a possible invasion of China to Taiwan, and that would cost globally around $1 trillion US dollars per year for the first few years. And I would like to ask for Dr. Lee's comments on that, please. Thank you.
Okay. I'm not sure who calculated this number. In my opinion, I have said, in my own opinion, I will say this number is way, way too small. It's way, way too small. If you follow the ideas we discussed here, the Taiwan Strait contingency could cause peninsula contingency. Actually, these two contingencies cause each other. Actually, there's a very serious spillover effect if China invade Taiwan, right? The impact gonna spill over to the East Asia countries, and like every country gonna feel the heat. So that's why former Japanese Prime Minister Abe said a Taiwan emergency is the Japanese emergency. The president of Philippines, Marcos, said it's hard to imagine how Philippines can avoid the Taiwan Strait conflict. If this is true, this assumption is true, how can it be just 1 trillion? Do you know how much the GDP Taiwan have? Taiwan GDP is around like 830 billion. Japan GDP is around 4.3 trillion. Korea GDP is around 1.3 trillion. And China GDP is around 15 trillion. And the market value of TSMC is around half trillion. If you just cause 1 trillion damage, I think this number is kind of encourage China to invade Taiwan, because it just takes 6% of China's GDP. If I am Xi Jinping, I would be very happy to attack Taiwan. It's just 6%. And I'm very surprised Taiwan government, no one in the Taiwan government stand out to argue this number, And moreover, you know, I'm the economist. I sometimes try to figure out the number from the stock market. You know, the tech giant like Apple, NVIDIA, AMD, they closely cooperate with TSMC. The market value, these three, market value is around 3 trillion. If Taiwan is under attack, the stock market in US gonna vanish maybe like 3 trillion. So how can it be 1 trillion? I don't know who calculated this number, but I really think this number is way, way too small. Thank you.
Well, debate over the numbers aside, it's important to never forget the economic consequences of such an action. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to invite Dr. Cha to the stage to offer some concluding remarks.
Thanks, Nick. Really a wonderful panel, excellent discussion, and really a great way to kick off what I hope will be a continuing dialogue among the three parties, CSIS, Yonsei Institute for Sinology, and INPR. Part of the discussion, we talked about multilaterals and minilaterals, so I'm happy to say that we've started our own minilateral here, a U.S. Korea Taiwan minilateral at Track 2. As many of you in DC and who come to these events know, Track 2 discussions are among experts and scholars, but they often are precursors to what eventually become Track 1 discussions. Not that that is the intention here, but I think it's important to start this dialogue. And, you know, the world is on fire right now, but if we meet again a year from now and it's less on fire than it is now, that should not distract or discount the importance of continuing a dialogue like this among the three organizations. As Director Kuo said in his opening remarks, you know, these are countries that share a lot of similarities in terms of regime type, in terms of market democracies, and in terms of the issues that they face and the values that they hold. So regardless of what the external environment is like, although it is very compelling right now, this is a dialogue that should continue. So with that, thank you everyone here in CSIS for joining us today. For those of you online, thank you also for joining us online. And to our panelists, thank you again for a wonderful discussion.